Welcome everybody to another episode of Critical Conversations. I'm Jared, and I'm with my co-host, Sam Castles.
Good to see you guys.
Yeah, we are excited to have another week here. Today we're going to be talking a bit about the Supreme Court. So I think that the next couple of weeks we're going to be discussing this, and a lot of this is in the news a lot the last couple of days, so I'm excited to talk about it. So
yeah, absolutely. It was pretty wild timing, and we had kind of already been thinking about talking about Supreme Court and all of the implications of the Supreme Court and the impact that it's had in the history of the Supreme Court, something that's really interesting to both of us. And then the tragic death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg sort of kicked us into gear, and we were like, well, I guess we'll do it this week. And it's unbelievable timing, really.
Yeah, it's crazy. And we'll get into it in a bit, but like the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg is just adds a lot to 2020. Like it's just it's a sad moment for sure.
Absolutely.
But it's been immediately turned into this political discussion, so we'll get into it for sure. Yeah, so this week we're gonna do a bit of news and talk about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and then we're gonna kind of break down some of the history and some of the things that have gone on with the Supreme Court and kind of judicial review and kind of these different issues and topics. And then hopefully we'll circle back and talk about some important Supreme Court cases next week and some just general topics about where the Supreme Court's going next and what that's going to be like. So
so we are filming this on Thursday, which is before the pick of the next Supreme Court justice. Trump's supposed to do that on Saturday. So as of recording, we do not know what this will be, but when we publish on Sunday, we will know. It sort of works out because we are wanting to do a two-part episode. It's our first two-part episode. There's just too much to talk about with the Supreme Court, especially with the news aspect of suddenly becoming a very current topic. And so we're hoping to sort of set that up this episode, and the next episode get into a little bit further details, a little bit more history, and talking a little bit more about the Supreme Court pick.
Hopefully we can talk about who the nominee is, and that'll be really good. So
I feel like I should ask you who you think it's going to be, and then I'll take the opposite stance, and then we can see who's right by the time this gets published.
I'm feeling like it's a pretty good chance Amy Coney Barrett is my top pick. That's I think most people's top pick. So that's going to be.
I think she definitely feels like the lead horse in the race. I mean, but Barbara Lagoa, I'm going to go with her just to oppose you. I'm going to go ahead and say that being from Florida, being Cuban American, is going to be the politics side that puts it over the edge, which I also feel like a little squeamish about. Like, should you really be picking your Supreme Court justice based on like identity and like helping you win an election in a state? Like, I don't love it. Not gonna lie.
That's where we're at. So
whatever it takes, I guess, at this point from both sides. So
I do
think on the low. I think your Amy Coney Barrett is going to be the
you gotta place a 3-name justice for another 3-name justice. That seems only fair.
Oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. That's super true.
But I do want to talk about one little bit of news before we dive into the rest of the SCOTUS stuff. So this has kind of been in the news and talking about this week, and it continues to be in the news, but I just wanted to bring up the idea of mail-in ballots in the election. And I think Trump's made some statements this week that are, talking about the ballots that seem very, just kind of are really interesting and have a lot of people talking. So I just kind of wanted to bring up, like, what do you think of mail-in ballots? And I think it's such an interesting election season because we've got so many people still in lockdown. You look at some of these states that are still in lockdown, they aren't going to be completely voting by mail. And then you have states like Texas where they're like, only if you're out of state or you can't vote in person can you use a mail-in ballot.
And every state's different with like when it needs to be postmarked, when it needs to be sent by then, received by then. It's wildly complicated. I'm probably less informed than you. I mean, I'm just going to vote in person, or at least I say that now.
Right.
Maybe if I get there and it's a 4-hour wait, I'll be like, one vote wasn't going to count anyway. Oh my
Yep.
gosh.
Well,
Sounds
so
bad, but
I
yeah.
just kind of wanted to like share a little bit of my history. So like when I was out of state at school, I tried to vote in the 2016 election, and so the process, if you don't know, you don't just get a ballot, you have to print out stuff or like send in a request for a request for ballot. Then you send in the request for the ballot, then you get the ballot, and then you send the ballot back in. So they're each at different like time frames before the election.
Yeah.
So I sent in my request for ballot 10 days before that was due, and it didn't make it in time from Arkansas to Texas. So like obviously I get that there's so many issues with the way these mail-in ballots work, and it's just going to be this really complicated issue. But I think, I don't know, I'm still formulating my opinion on this, but my gut instinct says to let mail-in ballots happen if they need to, because I think it's better that people can vote safely if they choose to do, no matter what you believe on the virus. If you feel safer doing that one way, that's going to be a minor, like if their vote gets lost, like I don't know. So Texas Supreme Court has announced that no one in Texas can vote from a mail-in ballot unless they have to. So Harris County, which I'm not sure exactly where that's located, but I think it's San Antonio area. I could be, or Austin. I could be wrong. But they tried to institute like sending everyone in their constituency requests for ballots. So not actual ballots, just requests. And Texas Supreme Court shot that down. Which, I mean, it's like if it's a local government and you want to pay for it and you want to do it, like that seems like you should be able to do that. And I get the argument against, voter fraud, and that's definitely scary.
Well, I mean, one thing I've heard is like a lot of, for example, parents whose kids are at college. A lot of times your kid's over 18, they can vote. Their ballots are going to come straight to the house. Like they're not going to come right away to the college or whatever. And no one knows who's living where. Like a lot of times those records are not up to date. It's wildly complicated.
It's messy.
Really is.
But I would encourage people listening, if, no matter where you are, look up what your rules for your state are. If you can vote in person, if you can't, and make sure you get that request in time, be registered and get those requests in if you need to do that. Although some people are living in states where they're literally just mailing the ballots themselves. Like California, I think it's just mailing ballots.
Like if you're a registered voter, it's
like if you're registered and voted, you will just like the census form, like you'll just get one in your mail and then you can fill it out.
Wild.
So that's crazy for sure. And I don't know what I think about that, but I definitely think like a request for ballot is different. But I don't know. It's a messy situation.
It is. It's kind of become this thing where the Democrats, it's done in the name of like anti-voter suppression, but it's very important to them that there's good turnout. Good turnout helps Democrats historically, especially the people that like younger people that don't tend to vote as much. They tend to vote increasingly Democrat. So that sort of getting them out in whatever way necessary is important to the Democrats. And I think from the Republicans side, they obviously don't want to like make it too easy. But also,
it's become so political so quickly. Like, I'm sure Harris County in Texas is a very much more liberal county, than the Supreme Court makeup of Texas is. So
I mean, and I also totally see the argument. Like, I mean, the people that you want voting are the people who are informed and like go find the ballot and make an effort to vote, and not people who just like, got something in the mail, like, I kind of see both sides of that for sure.
No, for sure. But
if you're sick or you're worried about getting sick and
because if you live in Texas, you've been able, and your job works from home, you've been able to get by pretty easily without having to go into big crowds of people. But if you want to vote, you're kind of out of luck. So I think that's tough.
It's definitely easy to say like, oh, well, just wait in line and socially distanced and stuff. but like if you've ever waited in a line during COVID, people are really bad at standing 6 feet apart. And it feels like if you're standing in a long line of people, you're 6 feet away, but you're standing where someone was, and someone will be, and it can't be good.
Although I will say the 2 places I've been with good lines, the only 2 are Trader Joe's. Is the first one. And the second one was when I went to get my title change for my car. Ooh. They had like dots across the entire building and outside, like the whole line, like, and like literally security guards standing like every 5 feet to make sure you were doing it.
Trader Joe's is no joke. We like didn't go to Trader Joe's for like 4 months because there was always a line outside the door.
For sure.
Yeah. There goes that really loud car again.
You've got the good mic, it'll pick it up,
Yep. Yeah, so it's a mess. Both sides are already planting the seeds, some maybe more directly than planting the seeds of manipulation, election fraud. It's going to get dicey.
We'll probably talk about that as we get closer again. So
Supreme Court might have to weigh in, and that's of course a different scandal. And wow. November in 2020, it's just going to keep going.
It's just one thing after another. So
one thing after another.
Yeah. So speaking of Supreme Court, we can move into talking about that now. So I have an article here from Politico, and they kind of combined a bunch of the Supreme Court justices' statements on Ginsberg's death. And I thought I'd just read some of the quotes from some of these because I think they're really powerful and they're really good and worth hearing. And before we get into the political divide and the political discussions, because I think Ginsberg was a force to be reckoned with in America, and a justice unlike any other and more famous than any other justice, I think. With movies and books and a cultural movement behind, like, no matter what you agree or disagree with most of her rulings, like she was an important figure in American life.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, John Roberts is saying here, he says, "Today we mourn with the confidence that future generations will remember Ruth Bader Ginsburg as we knew her, a tireless and resolute champion of justice." Gorsuch says, "Her sacrifices for the country were many, but were always performed with honor. We are blessed to have the happy memories remain, like traveling to her with London, where an uninformed guide kept calling her Ruthie, or when she tried to teach the opera to me, and her sweet tooth at lunch. We will miss Ruth, and our hearts go out to her and her family." And there's many others. I encourage you to read those statements from each of the other 8 justices, because I think they're worth reading. And so that happened on, what was that, Sunday? Monday?
No, it was Friday.
Last week? Okay, last Friday. Yeah, so it's been almost a week.
6 days, yeah.
But yeah, and I think after she passed away, and like people immediately jumped into political discussions, right? It was like, woke up Friday morning or whatever the next morning was, and it was just barrage of, McConnell already saying that, we're going to quickly vote in a new person, and Trump saying we're going to vote a new person. And it went pretty quick.
I mean, it's amazing to see what a big issue this is and how important this is. A lot of people will make the claim that in 2016, the biggest driving force for voters was in the presidential election was that power to nominate Supreme Court justices. Yeah. And it's amazing to see how influential the Supreme Court has become, what like a weighty, huge responsibility this is. There are so many factors that contribute to just the magnitude of appointing a Supreme Court justice that it can be a single issue for a lot of voters. Yeah. It's wild.
Yeah, it's crazy how there's a joke that my poli-sci division had, and it was political scientists like around were joking, but Gorsuch. So you'd list whatever, thing you didn't like about Trump or anything you didn't like about the
Right.
election in 2016, but you say, but Gorsuch. And we got our professor a stress ball that had Gorsuch's face on it and said, but Gorsuch.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
So yeah, pretty great.
Yeah. I mean, what is it? And this goes for a lot of Senate as well, like Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump. That's kind of their crown jewel, is how many justices they've appointed. I think he's at like 9,000 in his career.
It's not just Supreme Court, but it's these justices all over. We've had over 200 district court judges in the Trump presidency that have been confirmed, and that's not counting just the ones that have been nominated.
Right.
So it's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
The rehaul of the judiciary that has happened in the last 4 years.
Right.
So, and having potential of 3 Supreme Court picks in one 4-year presidency is unheard of. Like, that's crazy, in one term to have 3 picks potentially. And there were rumors that Thomas could step down. Like, it could have been 4 if he had chosen to retire. So would have been wild.
Well, I think on top of that, the second oldest judge is Kagan, right? What's Kagan's age?
I think so.
No, not Kagan. Kagan's 60. It's Breyer. Breyer is 82.
Oh, wow. Yeah, he's getting old.
And so Ruth Bader Ginsburg, when she died, was 87.
I want to say, yeah.
He's 82, and then the next oldest is Clarence, who's only 72. Only 72.
Yeah, only 72.
But
yeah.
So, I mean, it's remarkable that now what we're looking like, we're going to have 6-3 Republican, whatever, 6-3 conservative. There's like a lot of debate behind, like, well, are judges even conservative or liberal or Democrat or Republican? Like, a lot of, we can go into that a little bit later. But on top of that, the next oldest is also a more progressive liberal Democrat judge.
Right.
Who's Stephen Breyer at 82. So if he was the next to step down or pass away, something like that, it could even go further in the Republicans' direction. So it is a wild time.
Yep.
And I think we're starting to see a lot of desperation on the left. Like, how do we prevent this?
Yeah. So I'm curious.
Operate around this.
I'm curious to what you think on this whole. So we have the contrast between 2016 and now, right? So in 2016 so 2016 we had
Alito.
We had Merrick Garland.
Merrick Garland. Yeah.
So Merrick Garland was nominated by Obama, and the Senate Republicans at the time stonewalled and said, on the basis of protecting democracy and integrity and whatever, let the voters pick, and pushing it till November. And so obviously then Trump wins in 2016, and that's how Gorsuch gets in instead of Merrick Garland.
Right.
And then now you have the flip side. You have a Republican Congress that's like, let's get this done as quickly as we can. I'm wondering if you see a hypocrisy there, or is it just politicians being politicians? Like, what are your initial thoughts?
I mean, I think there's very clearly hypocrisy on both sides. It's very evident.
Yep.
I mean, the Democrats, you had, they were all pushing for this exact same thing 4 years ago. Even Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself, her dying wish, or one of them, was that Trump wait and not appoint a justice until the next election.
Right.
But in 2016, she was one of the first to say, you don't stop being the president in the presidential year. Like, it's his job to appoint. So whatever, that's true of Chuck Schumer. That's true of all those Senate Democrats the same way. And then I think a lot of Republicans, the exact same thing. I think now the Republicans are trying to claim, well, this is different because we have the presidency and the Senate, but I do not see that context sort of coming from them back in 2016.
There's a lot of loopholes that I've heard Republicans do to justify both positions.
A lot of gymnastics behind it.
And I'm like, clearly there's similar enough situations where a president, like, there's the lame duck argument. Well, Obama was going to leave anyway. It was have to be a new president. Trump could be reelected, so it wouldn't matter. So like, I get that, sure. But like Hillary would have kept Merrick Garland's nomination. So it wouldn't that's not that big a difference in my mind. And so I feel like what should have happened originally in 2016 was Senate Republicans should have sucked it up and just been like, okay, well, this is our responsibility, nominate Merrick Garland. So that if something like this happens, then you have the opportunity to get another justice on the court, which, but I also understand the temptation in 2016. They could do it, and they did, and they got the justice they wanted. So, and it's legal. There's no, legality against it. There's nothing in the Constitution saying you have to within 90 days of a nomination. Like, there's none of that. So
yeah, I definitely think I'm starting to see there are a lot of things that are done a certain way that are not mandated to be that way, but it's sort of, well, since we don't want to have chaos down the road, we're just gonna like abide by this, and then hopefully we work together. But it seems like with the increasing divide between Republicans, Democrats, this framing of like us versus them, it's a war, anything goes, sort of they screwed us over, so now we can do this. I mean, I've seen that attitude a lot on the right, like, oh, look what they did to Kavanaugh. Oh, they impeached him in election year, so therefore everything's on the table.
Right.
And we see that rhetoric coming from Democrats now, like, okay, well, if you pass and you pass through another Supreme Court nominee and approve them, then everything's on the table for us. So it's like,
right. So I've had some people that I respect and have written articles that I've read about how if this happens and this gets confirmed, which is looking like it probably will, whoever's the nominee will probably will probably get confirmed in the next 2 months or by the end of the year for sure.
Do you think it could happen before the election?
Potential. I mean, it's crazier things have happened. Like
they've had quicker ones before.
Yeah, they've had quicker ones before. And if you look at the Senate, so I follow the Senate cloakroom, which is like follows the Senate or just follows the Senate and what they're voting on Twitter, and they just tweet out constantly. It's 90% judges. Like, that's what they're doing. They are confirming judges. And so they're going to expedite this as fast as possible. But anyway, so I've seen lots of people talk about, well, if this happens and Democrats take over the House, the Senate, and the White House, then they will turn to court stacking as the next big push. And so bringing up the total to 13 or 15 judges and balancing the court back out, whatever that looks like, so that it's fair, or whatever the argument that you have there is. And then you could have the next president, let's say Biden wins, but is only in office 4 years, and a Republican takes office in 4 years. And then it's just like, I'm either A, not listening to the Supreme Court anymore because this bogus court stacking, or B, I'm going to court stack. And you have this full constitutional crisis. You've lost the filibuster in the Senate, which has to be gone away with anyway if you want a court stack. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, it is really interesting. That's kind of one of the things I was talking about, where it's like, well, I mean, the Constitution does not say 9 justices.
Nope. Yep. We had 7 for a long time in our
plenty of changes. FDR tried to change it to, was it 15?
15.
Because the Supreme Court was stepping on his mojo.
Yep.
And
get a lot of the war powers done that he wanted. So
it sort of feels like kind of what's happening now. Like, okay, it's a lame duck president, so we should just wait. You don't have to, but it'd be like a huge breach in like the trust or the communication between Democrats and Republicans. And this feels like another thing. Like, okay, well, we're only going to do it in retaliation. And it's opening a whole can of worms. But if you're not going to work with us, then that's what we're going to do. There's definitely going to be a lot of bluffing and things like that,
Oh, yeah. Well, because I can totally understand wanting to bluff this court stacking if you're not going to, because I mean, Biden's been very coy about the issue. Well, like not saying one way or the other, because that leads to potential to do that, and so it might persuade them to not nominate anyone. But
yeah, they've been talking about like keeping impeachment on the table,
right?
Again, just like, oh my gosh. So yeah, it has potential to get really dirty, really ugly. On the other hand, we know politicians love their gloom and doom like rhetoric. They know that motivates people to get out and vote. So I think it's in the interest of both sides to be like, this is devastating. The other side is unprecedented, yada yada, where both sides are going to talk a big game, and then November might come and go, and it might be back to normal. That's my optimistic take.
Right.
It's just a lot of hot air, but man, they definitely impeached Trump this year, and I would have thought that was all talk. But yeah, so happens, who knows? Yep. I mean, who knows?
Yep. No, it's crazy, and I'm of two minds about whether like this should happen in the first place, right? Like, I get that. Like, I don't want this escalation to happen, right? So my optimistic sense says it's fine, it won't happen, and so we can just go ahead and nominate somebody and confirm somebody. But the other side, I'm like, well, maybe we should just wait, like let November play out, and then. But the temptations is too strong for Republicans in the Senate. Like, it's just you have the opportunity now. You don't know what's going to happen in November, so I totally understand. Like, just especially with if there's there's going to be tampering calls in November, and whether the Supreme Court has to get involved, I don't know. But if they do, like, that's going to be an issue.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
So that's why they're going to want someone. That's the argument I've already seen several times. Like, we want someone on the Supreme Court by November to make a ruling so that there's not a 4-4 split.
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah, there must have also been a bit of political calculus into, well, do Republicans think we should wait and then say to our voter base, hey, you have to turn out so we can get this justice through.
That's
because that would also be true of the left. They must have thought, okay, well, the Democrats will do the same thing, and then this actually might turn out more Democrats, so maybe we just do this now, and it's not really going to turn out because it's already been decided or whatever.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a valid claim, and I think that worked in 2016. That brought a lot of people to vote for Trump that I don't know otherwise would. Now I feel like we're so set in our ways of what we know about Trump, because then it was like, well, Trump could be good, could be bad, but the Supreme Court's going to push me over the edge. Now we know what it's about, and so people are going to be more informed on what the issue is, and so the Supreme Court might not matter as much, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to say what could really happen to actually change people's minds. Like,
it
feels like that independent voter is very elusive. I feel like the bigger thing is getting your turnout up. Like, what's going to motivate your base?
Yeah.
I know a lot of people say that in 2016, you had the Mueller report on Clinton saying with the emails that happened really close.
Yep.
Or was that, wait, am I thinking of Comey?
To report, it's the email scandal was before Mueller report.
Yeah, that was before, but anyway, there was something really close to Election Day that started to swing the polls over like just a few days before.
It's crazy.
So, it is crazy. Something that always comes to my mind, and I know that this is more of a conservative-leaning take on it, but the Supreme Court being such a big deal, such an influential thing, is sort of a byproduct of over-activism by the court itself. It's become something that it wasn't intended to be. It's started to take a lot more of a legislature-like approach to things. Things are written more like statutes. It's solving these big cases that probably should be left to Congress, et cetera, et cetera. That's definitely, I think, again, like a more right-wing way of phrasing this, but I do think there's a ton of water to the statement that the court has just grown to monumental importance. This single issue deal is just fascinating how big it's become.
Well, yeah, and I think we can talk about this more when we kind of talk about the future of the court.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know if you saw Ted Cruz has a book coming out, I think next week now, that was been pushed up because of Ginsberg's passing and the new justice. But it's basically like it's called like One Vote Away or something. And it's basically saying that one vote in the Supreme Court matters so much for so many different things. And it's like, you're a senator, you have one of the most powerful like seats in America to pass legislation. Like, shouldn't that vote be so much more? And I get lost in it myself because I'm, I work at a law firm. Like, so much of our stuff is in the courts. So we're constantly like,
right.
And I think, obviously we're a law firm, so we have to work in the court system. That's how it works. But I get so lost in like, oh yeah, we got to do all these things through the courts and forget like, okay, there are other ways to solve these issues.
Of course,
than just the court ruling. But it's been that way for a long time now. Like, the Supreme Court has made monumental shifts in American culture. Like, you look back at Brown v. Board, like, these
oh my gosh,
huge things that have, Miranda rights, like all of these things have come from Supreme Court cases.
Yeah. It is the third branch of government, and it's 9 people, which is a small amount of people, and they're appointed for life. And impeaching them is a process,
and that virtually unheard of.
So it's amazing. It's grown to be very strong. And do we want to pivot a little bit to the founding and sort of the original intent of the Supreme Court? I know we sort of want to chronicle how it got to where it is today and its importance, and talk about if it was sort of always meant to be that way. But it definitely has to take a look back to the roots and history to answer that, I think.
Yeah. So I think, if we just go back to the like intense, like do you want to just read what the Constitution says? Like, it's not much. We've got this huge, okay, you can pull it up while I explain. Like, we've got this huge section of, the presidency and all what happens in the executive branch. Like, right, it's like very detailed, explained.
Right.
Then you've got all this stuff on the second article, like talking about Congress and how it's going to be broken up in House and Senate, like all these different things. And then you've got the Supreme Court, which by far has the least amount set on. It's Article 3.
Yeah, I'm getting there. I want to make sure I'm getting the actual text and not some. It is very short. All right, Article 3, Section 1. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior and shall, at stated times, receive for their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office.
And then Section 2 goes on to talk about states and the differences between that and like impeachment, and then it talks about like treason and stuff at Section 3.
It's pretty unrelated to the Supreme Court.
Yes, so it's really just that
Section 1.
Really Section 1, which is 2 sentences. Right? And there's no like outlines for term limits because they're lifetime appointments. There's no outlines for age. There's no official qualifications. So obviously America has good precedent, I think, in getting good Supreme Court justices. Like, they're some of the most brilliant minds in America.
Absolutely.
Like, in that sense, they've been good, but there's technically no qualifications that
no age limit like there is for president or senator.
Right.
But
so it's kind of crazy that we have like, not much. But basically the idea of the Supreme Court is to handle cases and handle things that lower courts have disagreements on and lower courts have issues with, right? But I think,
because we know the appealing process is a really important part of the judicial system. But it stands to reason that it has to end somewhere.
Right. So kind of the process in America. So I'll kind of give a brief overview of like where cases go, where they come from. So, depending on where it starts, it will start either in like a local state branch, and if it's has to do with the state government, it will eventually go through state district courts and then the state Supreme Court. And then if you appeal from the state Supreme Court, it goes directly to the US Supreme Court. So there's no federal issue in between there. So it goes straight from the state Supreme Court to the federal. But if it's a federal issue, so it's a federal crime, or if it's between states, or if it's a civil issue between like any of that, it starts in the district courts, and then you have the federal court of appeals. So that's if you feel like you didn't get your justice in the district courts, you then appeal to the federal court of appeals, which there are 12 of them, 13 if you count DC. And then if you appeal from those courts, then you go to the Supreme Court. So it's this, process of appeals that gets all the way to the Supreme Court.
So when people say the Ninth Circuit courts, is that second one right before the Supreme Court?
So that is the Court of Appeals, yes.
Okay.
So if you say the Ninth Circuit, First Circuit, like those cover districts in America. So the Ninth Circuit, so the Fifth Circuit covers like the South. So it's like Texas, and it goes into like Tennessee area, like it kind of goes off east from Texas. And then
those are all nominated by the president and approved by Senate.
So
all those judges,
all federal judges, so not just circuit judges, but also district judges are appointed by the president, approved by the Senate. So there's like 900 something total. Yeah. It's a lot, when you go down to district courts. But then there's also two processes in circuit courts. So you could lose at the circuit court, so how circuits work is you get 3 judges to review your case. So if you've appealed to a circuit court, you get, I don't know if they draw hats or like if they choose, I'm not sure how the process of getting 3 works, but you get heard by 3. Right. And then if you could appeal to that same court and ask for an en banc hearing, if you've ever heard that term, and that has to gather all of the justices on the circuit court. So there could be up to I think the Ninth Circuit has 18 justices on it, and all of those would have to review your case. And then you could still go to the Supreme Court. But usually it ends after a circuit court appeal or an en banc hearing.
Yeah. And there are some cases that can go directly to the Supreme Court, and they don't have to start anywhere.
Yeah, so if they come from the state Supreme Court, remember they can go straight to the Supreme Court, which that doesn't happen as often because it's usually federal issues that go to the Supreme Court. But it's all up to the Supreme Court justices. So 4 of the justices have to choose whether to take a case. So they can step in and rule on a case like they did in 2000 when they talk about Bush. They stepped into the case and they're like, hey, we're going to talk about this, give a ruling. No one gets another word, right? Doesn't have to go through the whole process. So the Supreme Court will occasionally step into an issue when a quick ruling is needed, and declare a ruling. But most of the time, it takes 5 years to get to the Supreme Court, right?
Right. It's a serious process, yeah.
It is involved. Just to give some sort of context, there are, I think it's 10,000 requests to the Supreme Court every year, and the judges take about 70.
Wow.
So it is.
I mean, they must be spending a lot of their time just figuring out what they want to hear.
So there's this thing called the Great Conference in October, or the Big Conference or something, and all the justices gather around and they look over the summer and the last spring because they're off in the summer, and then they just look through all their cases. They just gather around a table. I'm sure their aides have prepped and whatever. The cases. But then they just decide, and if they have a vote of 4, then they will take and listen to that case. But it's so few in comparison to how many are requested.
Absolutely.
It's kind of crazy. So
wild.
Yeah, so that's a brief overview of how things work at the Supreme Court.
Yeah, thank you for running that down.
Yeah, and so I think I'll add this as the important milestone in the early history of the Supreme Court is Marbury v. Madison. So this is this happened about 12 years after the founding of the court. So it was 1801, I think. Yeah, so 1800 was when it kind of started, but it was 1801 when this case happened. And it basically establishes the power of judicial review. which the judicial review is basically the ability to look at a case that has already happened and decide whether it's true or not, and then that sets precedent for the future. So it has a whole lot wrapped in it, but it's basically a lot of what the Supreme Court does today is they look back and they establish, and then they can set precedent on certain issues in law, and they're allowed to do that. So they basically established their own sense of law, right?
Right.
They basically said, hey, we have the power to look at laws and say whether they're true or not, and then that becomes fact. And then America was like, okay, yeah, sure.
Right.
The Supreme
Yeah,
Court doesn't have
like
any executive power. So
right, and like we read in the Constitution, it was extremely vague.
Right. There's no judicial review. It's just like they will rule on what, like, was their precedent become law? Like, what does that mean? And so
Right.
judicial review firmly established what the Supreme Court would become in Marbury v. Madison.
So is there any wiggle room, and you like briefly said earlier when we were talking about sort of alternatives to diminishing the power of the Supreme Court, or if worse comes to worse, could an executive branch just choose to ignore the Supreme Court? Like, what would that be against Marbury versus Madison, or would it be against the Constitution? Like, how would an argument like that run?
So it's interesting. So basically, Marbury v. Madison establishes whether something's the judicial review, which establishes whether something is constitutional or not. So potentially, you could say if the president or Congress chose to ignore something that the Supreme Court says, then they're going against something unconstitutional, because technically this court has the power to declare something unconstitutional.
Right.
But the Supreme Court said that they did.
Right.
Technically, it's not in the Constitution. But again, I mean, these are like, early justices in 1800. So this is established as, we've never had really a case where they just completely go against the Supreme Court ruling.
Right.
Although it looked like it could potentially back in Brown v. Board, like there were some, they're not always immediate when the court rules something because they have no executive power.
Right. There's no way to actually follow through or enforce it.
Right. They have to leave that up to the federal or state governments.
Of course. Yeah.
But it is interesting that we could have, if someone decided to not agree with the Supreme Court ruling, we would have a constitutional crisis.
Right.
So just like any constitutional crisis where you decide to do something unconstitutional, that's just we wouldn't really know what to do. We'd be in uncharted territory at that point.
Right.
And
it's
I think
important. Go ahead.
Oh, I think that's why you see Roberts being very moderate in his ruling, since he's taken power in a world of shifting alliances and a world of more and more partisanship and negative partisanship.
Right.
He, as Chief Justice, has chosen to stay firmly in the middle and not give, there's no, we've had no abortion cases that have overturned Roe v. Wade. We've had no crazy other cases that, some of them have been pretty major, but in general, it's always they're kind of important, they're kind of impactful, but not as much as they could have been, because Roberts is we don't want to have a point where the next president or the current president decides we don't agree.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. His sort of transition has been very interesting. I don't know as much about his reasoning and things like that, but I was going to say a minute ago, it's really important to remember Marbury versus Madison was decided in 1803. And, those are Madison is one of the founders, one of the framers of the Constitution, yada, yada. It stands to reason that if this ruling was in gross controversy with the Constitution, and the framers themselves have been that's not what we meant, there would have been a lot more debate about that. So even though it was debated, I think at the end of the day, the framers themselves were this is sort of what we had in mind. I don't know as much about the actual criticism and dilemma, but
yeah, and I think it's generally understood that this is a good thing. Marbury v. Madison, judicial review is a good thing, right? Because we have all the time, we have a thing called a circuit split, where a similar issue comes up in the Ninth Circuit, which is California, and the West Coast, and a similar issue comes up in the Fifth Circuit, and the Fifth Circuit rules one way, and the Ninth Circuit rules the opposite. And so what do you do? Like, these are similar issues, and that's why you have the Supreme Court that can then declare, okay, that one is constitutional, that one is not. Like, you have to have some sort of final say.
Yeah, and it's been framed as, part of the check and balance system. If you have a Congress who's partisan one way, and then the president happens to be the same way, that's why we have the Supreme Court. They're in there for life so that they can't be swayed by a quick movement to one side, and they're there to sort of slow down the process and make sure that nothing is rushed into by a swing to power from one side or the other.
Right, and I think it's worth noting that no matter who's nominated and who's confirmed to the Supreme Court, they're going to live on the Supreme Court for a long time, and they're not necessarily going to vote the way we think they're going to vote. Roberts, when he came on the court, was appointed by a Republican president, was assumed to be very conservative, and he's, as Chief Justice, he's moved very moderate, and he just kind of stays in the middle. So Gorsuch hasn't been as conservative as he could have been either. As Kavanaugh, like, they've both had issues.
Kavanaugh, was supposed to be very conservative. I think he's tended a lot more moderate than people might have expected.
And I think I think what people forget to realize is that these justices know what their place, and they realize, and they're like, these issues are so complicated that they're not just going to say, oh, it's this conservative issue and that's the way we vote, and it's not like the Senate. Like, their minds think differently.
Right.
And I think that's a good
thing. They're not nominated through a party per se. We just sort of happen to see that presidents and senates tend to choose judges that line up more with their ideology. But yeah, at the end of the day, there's no such thing as a Republican Supreme Court justice.
Right, and they don't get reelected, so they're not worrying about interest. They're not worrying about lobbying as groups. They're not worried about money. Like, they are pretty stationary, so that gives them legal room to move in there.
Sort of why it's structured that way.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, what else do we want to talk about?
We could talk a little bit about why some justices tend to be favored by Democrats and what that sort of political philosophy or philosophy behind the Supreme Court is in their cases, as opposed to a Republican nominee, why there's such a divide. We could talk about maybe why the Supreme Court has become so big since Marbury versus Madison, either direction. Those things are related.
I think kind of one of the ways to frame how the differences between more conservative judges and more liberal judges is in judicial interpretation, right? So judicial interpretation is the different ways the judges look at the Constitution in order to inform their opinions and what they write. And there's different ways, the Constitution can be vague, it can be hard to read, so there are different ways that different judges choose to interpret it, and I think that leads to different outcomes. So I can kind of talk through, or we can talk through some of those different types of interpretations.
Let's talk about that for a minute.
Okay. Go ahead.
Well, it's sort of difficult to talk about this in a balanced way, because right off the bat you have these terms and buzzwords that are thrown around, and they're very typical of politicians. They love to frame things as like, I'm a this word, which is a positive thing, and obviously you would support this because I'm this. And it's like we had joked about like naming something the Patriot Act,
right.
Or what was like tough on crime, like who could be against tough on crime?
Right.
So you see a lot of more Republicans, conservatives frame their justices as the originalist and the textualist, and then you see them sort of paint the other side as, they believe that the that the Constitution is a living document, and they like to take their adaptations and make up rulings and things like that. But
Right.
yeah, it's hard to sort of break it down into this sort of two schools of thought because it's not as clear cut as that.
No, there really aren't two schools of thought.
Right.
There's lots of schools of thought, and there's lots of nuances that come with each school of thought.
Right.
I think the simplest one to start with is Scalia, and kind of pioneering or taking hold of the idea of originalist. So originalism is this idea of basically as it was intended. So it's not slightly different from textualist, which looks at the Constitution itself. So they read the Constitution and they say, that's what it says, so we're going to do that because that's what's in the text. Originalist is very similar. It's basically saying, okay, what did the framers exactly intend when they wrote this document? So it's not like just reading at face value the text, but like, okay, what did the framers mean? What is the original part of this?
So there's a little bit more room for interpretation for an originalist than a textualist.
Yes, correct. So a textualist is going to be a little bit, it doesn't work very well is the point, because you look at the Constitution and you read the text and you're like, I have to do exactly what that says, but it doesn't apply to this, or like it doesn't cover the situation, right? So the originalist would be like, okay, so what did this means this, which must mean that the framers would wanted this. And so it's a little bit more nuanced, and it's not perfect either. Scalia is like ruled against his originalist principles because different cases mean different things, and not everything's covered in the Constitution. So
I watched like a really short clip where basically back in 2013, Sotomayor was asked, "Oh, are you an originalist or someone who believes that the Constitution is a living document?"
Very loaded question.
Right, very loaded. And I don't think the 60 Minutes host meant to say it like it was a loaded question, but she sort of was like, well, I don't even really like to use these terms because, like, she would say, what did she say? She said, basically, when you read the Constitution, you have words that are there for a reason, but we have to figure out, well, what is, like, she's talking about quartering soldiers. The court cannot, or the government cannot force people to quarter soldiers in their home. Well, what does it mean to quarter? What does it mean to be a soldier? If you look at the Second Amendment, you have like, well, what's a well-regulated militia?
Right, what is a militia? Yep.
Yeah, where she's like, okay, books and shelves of books have been written on what each of these words means in the Constitution.
Individually, just the one word.
Right. So that's sort of her idea of, well, that's where the court comes in to figure out, well, how do I make sense of what this is and how do I apply it to now? And I've heard other more liberal commentators say, well, yeah, I mean, the Constitution there are a lot of days where it's outdated, like it will refer to the president and the vice president as he, and like, okay, well, obviously it's not just limited to being men anymore. Guns are completely different now, and well, it's a different time, so we have to find a way to bring it into the 21st century.
Right. And I think it's worth noting, like, the framers didn't have perfect like vision, like they didn't know exactly what 21st century America was going to look like. So that definitely has to be room for some different stuff.
Right.
There's Go
ahead.
Oh, I was just going to move on to other like types of judicial interpretation. So
let me say one more thing. You might be able to fit this in, but knowing that the future was going to evolve and there is going to be room for interpretation, and things are going to change and get more complicated. I think that's where your more self-described originalist, textualist judges might say, okay, that's true, but that's not our job to take us into the 21st century. It's the job of the Congress to legislate and decide these things, and it's our job to interpret, like, is this anti-constitutional in the way that it was originally described? Like, if, another issue is like amending the Constitution is very difficult too. So I understand judges being like, okay, well, we can't, the Constitution is basically set how it's going to be forever. So they're obviously going to be times where we have to move on, move forward, and not just stick to the same thing. But yeah, I mean, it's easy to start noticing where it gets dicey. Like,
Yep.
When is it okay to interpret in today because we realize this is an old document that we can't amend? And when is it like, well, we'll leave it up to the legislature and sort of only step on their toes when it's blatantly unconstitutional, something like
right.
that.
And that's what's tough. Like, you know, you want to give the power to the Senate and you want to give the power to Congress to do things that, or the president, like, you know, to create these laws, but it's also, you have the power to just set things as they are. So I get that that's hard to not want to do. And that's why often you'll get rulings that are like very vague and like, they just rule on that one issue, but they're not a broader ruling. It's like, where's the broader ruling? It's like, well, that's not really their responsibility.
Right.
And so it depends on the justice who's going to, you know, decide that way or not.
Yeah. And sorry, we're keeping going here, but we know that the Congress loves that. They love being able to pass the buck on to the Supreme Court. We've talked about this. Oh, I guess we haven't, but something that I definitely see a lot is, we'll just found, you know, an agency, right? We just institute an agency and like, you know, the Environmental Protection Agency. I pick on them for no reason, but basically we don't want to sit here and sort through all of the environmental issues. It's too complicated. There are way too many things to consider. So we're just going to found this agency, and now we don't have to deal with that anymore. Yep. And now we're going to give them the power to make these statutes or whatever.
That's been in the Supreme Court, whether they're allowed to do that, but that's another issue. Like that's, that was
a whole other thing. But Congress loves that because they basically, if something comes back that's poor, you know, you can't hold your senator or congressman accountable because it was the EPA, it wasn't the senator. And it's the same thing. Like the Congress, they don't want to rule on abortion. They don't want to rule on gay marriage. They don't want to rule on these huge decisions that the courts are making because the courts can't get voted out. They can't be held accountable in the same way that the Congress can. So,
which it's a double-edged sword, right? Like, because you see things like Brown v. Board when they're more like ahead of the curve. It's like, this is a great thing that they were able to rule out because that could have never gotten through Congress. But then it's the opposite when it's, you know, these other issues that it's like, well, you shouldn't have been, you know, you need to take responsibility for these actions.
Right.
So.
Yeah, but you can see how it's a win-win for Congress because they use the Supreme Court to draw out voters for themselves. You got to vote for our party. We got to get this justice nominated. And then they pass all the responsibility off to the judges.
Yeah, it's such an interesting cycle that you can just be like, well, I may have not done anything for you this year, but I voted for like 50 judges that will rule in your favor on key issues. So
that is a lot of Mitch McConnell's speeches. I mean, he's definitely not popular in his
Kentucky,
yeah, but they will keep voting for him because of the work that he does with those judges. So.
Yep. Which, I mean, I fall into that trap all the time. I'm like, because his judges, I think, are really good. And so it's like, well, then it's fine. You know, like, I'll vote for you again if you vote for the right judges. But it's just passing the buck, and it's it's a way of thinking we have to break out of a little bit, I think.
Right.
So.
Wild.
I think there are other kinds of judicial interpretation too. We've talked about, like, you know, a little bit more activist types, and there's different the courts have gone through different eras throughout history, depending on who the Chief Justice is, whether they want to lead the court and to be more activist, to be more conservative. Right now, you'd say we'd have a more conservative court in that it's not making these big rulings, with the exception of a few things like gay marriage. But in general, it's been pretty, like, the big issues have been pretty case by case basis and not these big rulings.
Right.
And I think one of the things that we can talk about more next week as we look at some of the important cases, because we're already running a little bit long here. So, but is this idea of precedent, right? So this is a really big, important part of the Supreme Court, is looking back on previous Supreme Court cases and using that to base your decisions on future cases. So you look back at, I'll use Lemon v. Kurtzman, which I might talk about next week, but it basically sets this standard for whether something is religious, whether it violates the Establishment Clause. All right, that's kind of what it's this test that the Supreme Court outlined. And it's like, okay, so in the future cases, when we have that, we have this lemon test to go back through, and that's what makes our future case, like, that's how we rule. And it's like, but is that something that you should overturn? Like, can you overturn past precedent? Because that happens a lot too.
Right.
So there's that whole, like, it's not just the Constitution anymore that they're ruling off of, they're also ruling off past precedent.
Right.
And whether,
right, like,
whether that's real, like whether you should let precedent from 100 years, like, is that, okay, that's safe, but anything in the last 25 years, it's kind of more gray, we can overturn that kind of stuff.
There's a lot of gray area there where it's like, we're technically probably shouldn't overturn this, but legally we can.
Yeah.
And a lot of justices are more comfortable overturning precedent. Some are just will not do it basically under any circumstance.
Or it depends on the issue.
Yeah, you have gray areas where it's like, well, this case is sort of similar. We're overturning parts, but not the whole thing.
Or that case was ruled really poorly because of this logic, and so I would never overturn precedent, but because of that bad logic, this is what the right precedent. It's like, okay.
Yeah, so much gray area. A lot of mental gymnastics for sure.
Yep.
Yeah, and I know a complaint from a lot of more originalist, textualist, right-leaning judges or pundits is, well, the Supreme Court is no longer just ruling constitutional, unconstitutional. They're framing their decisions like statutes. They're starting to use the statute like formula, and they're going into areas that don't really touch the case. And we can talk more about that next week as we get into the more particular cases, but that is a big critique from the right. And yeah, it's again this idea of, well, you're unelected, we can't vote you out. If we don't like your decision, you need to stick to calling things constitutional or unconstitutional.
Although I would almost argue in the last, I would argue in the last like 5 years in this election cycle, conservatives have moved away from that, and how now, like, the court's all good because we have the court on our side now, right? And it's that same kind of hypocritical, like,
and I knew you were gonna say that. I totally agree.
So, but I'd say in general, conservative principles is usually let the court just rule and then let Congress do it, which is what I would agree. But like now it's like, well, if we can get our things done easier and quicker, and we don't have to worry about, especially if there's a House, Senate, and White House all in one party, have a Supreme Court that is in your favor.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And we have seen the federal government grow to like a ridiculous size.
Oh, yeah.
We've seen agencies, like the amount of US code and federal code that is written is just stupendously large. And I totally get, like, well, now what do we do? Because Congress definitely can't handle everything, because there's so much. But again, that's just, that's way more in the weeds on the small government versus big government. But it's quite a web. It really is.
Yep. Well, I think that's a good place to stop for this week. That was a lot of info. So, but I personally love the Supreme Court. I don't know if that came through at all.
It's fascinating.
I think it's fascinating. I love the ideas behind, the judiciary, and I'm happy. It's fun to talk about. Thanks for sharing the expertise. And it's like we said, we were looking forward to talking about it anyway, but here we are. It's back on the forefront. Seems like that's not going away anytime soon. Yep. So go ahead. No, I was just going to change. I was just going to say our future selves will know soon what the outcome is. So Yeah, we'll be back here next week sort of talking about that and some more history and sort of what's the way forward. How does this proceed? Is this going to be something where it's just back and forth, and we sort of have this idealistic third branch of the government? It's separate from the two-party system, and it's impartial, and they're there for life, and they're stuck to their principles. And now we're like, well, now you can just stack and go around, and
I guess we're back to like not really having. It's just another way for, yeah. So hopefully we can get more into the weeds on that.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, super interesting. Do you remember? Do you remember how I met Catherine, my wife?
Yeah, it was through con law class. Was it con law or something?
Yeah.
Okay,
Constitutional law
Yes.
summer camp. So in a way, the Supreme Court and all of his decisions are the reason. It's the reason I'm married today.
Wow,
So
incredible.
You could definitely argue that.
Love it.
Yeah, so really interesting. I think it's fascinating.
Cool.
Crazy.
All right. Well, do you have a recommendation for us before we?
I do. I'm gonna share my screen for this one.
Ooh, awesome.
Let's see. Oh, you have to enable.
Oh no! I remembered last week. I didn't remember this time. All right, it's enabled.
We always remember.
I know. We always remember.
Okay, where do I? All right, I'm annoyed. Why doesn't it come up as one of the options? I have literally so many things open that it can't find. All right, here we go. I got it. All right, so this week I am recommending a podcast called Monday Morning Dad by Ryan Shaughnessy. So Ryan Shaughnessy is a good friend of mine up here in Fairfax area, Fairfax County. He lives nearby. We're in a small group at church together. He was one of the first people that I met when I moved down to Virginia. Cool. Introduced me to my church and a lot of my good friends now. So really thankful for Ryan. He's done a lot for me. I think my first apartment I found through him and another guy, and he's just done a lot to help me get set up and all of that. Great guy. This is a podcast about being a dad, and it's specifically through the lens of being a Christian and wanting to raise your kids in a biblical way, learning from the wisdom of others. So he does a lot of guests. He has people on pretty much every week, and you can see I haven't listened to all of them. I need to get on it, but this ones I have listened to have been awesome. Really encourage that, especially if you're a dad or going to be a dad soon or want to be a dad down the road. That's where I'm at, and recommend his podcast absolutely.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's been really fun. I know he had said there's a lot of podcasts and resources out there for moms, but not as many for dads.
I feel like that's a whole subculture is moms and like things for them, but it's not often you don't talk about dads the same way.
Yeah.
That's
so
really cool.
I really appreciate his heart for being dad is an important role and wanting to do that well. And he has 2 daughters, and it's awesome to see him be a dad. And I'm excited to keep hanging around him and his kids and his wife and learn from him and listen to this podcast. Yeah.
Very cool. Okay, cool. Well, I think that wraps it up. So
yeah, I think we had a long episode here.
Yeah, thanks if you sat through this whole thing. Thank you.
Yeah, that's sort of ridiculous.
Yeah, but and remember we're on YouTube and Spotify and Pocket Casts and a whole bunch of other places. I think we're on like 9 different platforms now, so that's pretty cool. And we're on Facebook, Critical Conversations. You can go like our page for news and updates and all that good stuff.
Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Have a good one, guys.
All right.
See you next week.